Today we're going to start with Professor Mohan Martin, who's going to be talking about his flavor aesthetic, his food art. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask just a very traditional questions which are up there. And I want to ask them in what I think is a very traditional way. So it actually fits in quite well with the sort of thing that Sarah was saying yesterday, surprisingly enough. So my answer to this question is a sort of pedestrian, yes, but. So I'm going to be very cautious in everything I say. Anyway, so one concept that I want to just introduce here, I don't think it's mine, but the word might be mine, of integrated art. Art is just one piece. So if you take, for instance, this new airport, you'll see a slide of it a little later. It just opened in Beijing, which is by the architect. What's his name? The name of the architect was on the slide. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So, and it's in the shape of a starfish. Now, it's an airport. It's a work of art. But it's not a work of art as an airport. I mean, the two functions are kind of separate. It doesn't in any way, its airport functions, whatever it is that makes it an airport, is not the same thing as whatever it is that makes it a work of art. All right. So similarly, this thing here is a cake. And it is also a work of art, but whatever it is that makes it, I mean, it is a pretty awful work of art, you have to admit. But whatever it is that makes it a cake are not the same as whatever it is that makes it a work of art. Now let's look at an integrated work of art. That is, I don't know if any of you have seen this, but it's a work called Corollarium by Jason DeCare Taylor, and it was built in the Maldive Islands, and then destroyed, by the way, because it has human representations which were incompatible with Islam. So the work of art was created in 2018 and destroyed right away. So the thing about it is it's a reef. That's why it's called Corollarium. And it's also a work of art. But it isn't merely a reef that's made to be aesthetically or artistically pleasing. The qualities that make it art prominently include its being a reef. And the artist actually says this. I mean, there's a whole write-up about how the material is pH neutral so that coral can actually be built on it, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to use a concept that Carolyn Korsmeyer uses quite a lot in this context. So he says she uses the word exemplification. And exemplification is a symbolic relation in which an object both possesses a property and denotes that property or refers to that property. So in this case, that object there possesses the property of being a reef, but in some sort of way which is not clear to me and will not be clear to you at the end of this talk either. But in some sort of way, it refers to the property of being a reef. It doesn't merely instantiate it, right? It does something more. It says, so let's just think of that as saying, I am a reef. Right? That work of art says, I am a reef. So it's an essential part of appreciating Taylor's work to recognize or to know both that this thing is a reef and to know that it is saying that somehow it's referring to its property of being a reef. Now, I think that's an unclear notion, and as I say, it's difficult to make it clear, but we're going to run with it. So let's say an item with a function other than being a work of art is integrally a work of art, an artwork, if, and maybe only if, but I won't argue that, but if it exemplifies this other function, right? So that thing is a reef, and it exemplifies being a reef. And exemplifying, remember, is being a reef and referring to it, the property of being a reef. And appreciating it as an artwork substantially depends on this exemplification relation. So integration is an issue for every work of art. I mean, integration is a work of art for narratives. I mean, you can have narratives which are works of art because in part they say, I'm a narrative, or pictures, or musical performances, etc. There are pictures which don't do that, and they're not works of art. So exemplification is what makes it an integrated artwork, not merely a functional item that also happens to be aesthetically pleasing. So here's the airport. So Dashing Airport does not denote or refer to being an airport. So it is a small part of, it is a part of appreciating the airport as a work of art, to appreciating the work as a work of art, to recognize that it is an airport. I mean, you've got to say that's an airport, right? But it doesn't, there's no part of appreciating that. I mean, it isn't an exemplification. It doesn't say, I am an airport in any particular way. Just, it's an airport which is nice to look at. And that's all that it is. Well, maybe a little bit of exemplification. So those boarding piers there, they exemplify boarding piers, and that's what makes it interesting that the boarding pier looks like the arm of a starfish. And look at this bottom starfish arm here. That's just a walkway to the parking lot. It's not a boarding pier. So the fact that the other ones are boarding piers makes it sort of a pun, that this one, a visual pun, that this one is a walkway. So there's some little exemplification going on, but it's a very small part of what's going on in this airport. As for Carême's cake, it does not exemplify being a cake. In fact, it's pretending to be a castle. And Carême's cake does not seem to draw attention to itself as a cake, right? And I don't know if there's any denotation there at all. It's kind of, it's totally unintegrated as far as that's concerned. So can food be an integrated work of art, a work of art that is a work of art because it exemplifies food? So recently there have been various attempts to do that, but let me take this canonical example from Korsmeier. She says that the Jewish Passover Seder commemorates the exodus of Jews from captivity in the table, and in the center there's the Seder plate, and on it are placed 6 foods, and each of these foods signifies some aspect of the exodus, right? I won't go through the list, but it's quite interesting. And you might say that the food on the Seder plate refers to Passover, perhaps by exemplifying food, right? There's some, essentially, it does that through the fact that it is food. So there's some significance to the fact that these are a part of a table for a meal. Here's another example. This is the dining project, and this is in the Taipei Fine Arts Museum. So Li Mingwei tries to answer the question, what is eating, or how is the setting for a meal created, by getting strangers to eat at the same table together. So they just sit there and some food is brought out. And they somehow negotiate the fact that they don't know each other. So this is a sort of immersive artwork. You have to be one of those 2 people in order to appreciate the artwork. And in this, eating signifies eating, and the food on the table refers to the food on the table, and there's some significance in all of those facts put together. I won't try to give you an interpretation of the work, but thanks to Barry Smith for this example. He wanted me to talk about it, but I refused. So food can be integrated art and an integrated part of art, but that's not the question that I want to ask. Right? The question that I want to ask is, can food be a work of art in virtue of exemplifying flavor? Right? Can it, in other words, can a flavorful object be an integrated work of art, qua flavorful? Can it not only have these properties, these flavor profiles, but also be a work of art in virtue of having that flavor profile, and not in anything else? It might have all sorts of other things. It might be visually attractive. It might refer to it might refer to the nation of Mexico. But that's not the question that I want to ask. I just want to know. So, I want to ask a very simple question. If I make a crab cake, and it's a really great crab cake, right? Is that enough for it to be a work of art? Is it enough to be for it to be aesthetically pleasing? What does it have to do in order to be both an object of aesthetic appreciation and furthermore to be an art object? So I've been writing recently about aesthetic appreciation, and I have a theory of it, and I'm just going to use that theory. Hopefully it doesn't depend on that particular theory. There may be other theories, and hopefully the results will be the same, but I want to just use that theory to examine the question, at least to show you some layering. So here's another example. Once again, is Carolyn Korsmeyer, and it's a pretty humble dish. They're not going into 3-star Michelin restaurants or anything of that sort. It's just chicken soup, and not the fancy French cream of chicken soups, but just ordinary Jewish chicken soup so there's an actual, the clear broth remains there. That's the important thing. So she says it possesses a variety of properties: flavor, saltiness, and a somewhat oily texture. That oily texture is masked in the cream of chicken soup, which is why I don't want to take that. The ingredients are more or less present in the final product, and the sipper of the soup may attend to them appreciatively. The properties, say, of a subdued hint of parsnip, well cloaked by onion and dill, is exemplified in the soup in much the same way as being in a minor key may be exemplified in music, and being blue exemplified by certain Picasso paintings. Now, Korsmeyer thinks that chicken soup is replete, and what she means by that is that she thinks it's got piles of these sorts of exemplification properties, not just one. Like the airport might have had just a few, but she thinks that this has a whole lot. So I'm not sure whether she thinks that the oily texture of chicken soup, which is so characteristic of it, I don't know whether she thinks that that is also exemplified. I don't. So I think that the oily texture of the soup and that chickeny flavor and the saltiness of it, that those are objects of appreciation but not art objects. So I'll come to that, why I think that. But what's really interesting is this more subtle thing, namely a subdued hint of parsnip well cloaked by onion and dill. Who puts parsnip into chicken soup? So that's part of it. Oh, I see. Okay, well, there you go. All right. I didn't know that. I'm not Jewish, in case you didn't notice.
It's standard.
All right, good. Thank you. It is standard, but not so. All right, so there you go. So the question is, conceding that these are features of appreciative attention, what makes them denotative? Right? Does the oily texture of chicken soup refer to the oily texture of chicken soup? Does the hint of parsnip refer to the hint of parsnip? And is there a difference between the oily texture of chicken soup and the hint of parsnip with respect to these? Or do they all have to be treated in the same way? So Korsmeyer uses this, Korsmeyer uses this example to demonstrate that flavor can be the object of aesthetic appreciation. And I'll use my theory of aesthetic enjoyment to bolster her point. Though, as we'll see, there's something slightly odd about this case, something slightly non-standard about it, which Korsmeyer doesn't dwell on. But a question remains about exemplification and art, and I'll sketch a theory of cultural learning that addresses the exemplification question. So so two parts of my theory. One is the theory of aesthetic enjoyment, and I want to say, yes, it's an object of aesthetic enjoyment. And the second part about cultural learning, which has to do with parsnips. I want to say that that has something to do with it as well. Okay. I want to show that food can be integrated art, qua flavorful. Okay. So the basic idea of my theory of aesthetic enjoyment or aesthetic pleasure is that, first of all, it's positively valenced. What that means is that you like it. Why would I have said positively valenced? That's just because you need to be a little pretentious here. But you like it, it's nice, right? But it is a nice perceptual or cognitive attitude. I'm not even going to argue about that. So Sarah's given us as much argument as we need to know that it is perceptual or cognitive. And that pleasure or that enjoyment or the fact that you like it motivates and more importantly supports a difficult act of cognitive engagement with the object. Now, it's very important to me that this act is in fact it doesn't just come easily. It's difficult, right? And also, it's important to me that this act is something that it's an act, it's something you do, right? And the pleasure helps you, not only motivates you to doing it, but helps you do it. So it's not, my notion of pleasure is not that of a mere sensation, which is the attitude that a lot of people have taken. So I want to talk about these difficult acts, right? So I have this notion of an assembled routine. An assembled routine is a precisely constructed structure of simple actions or acts which are willed as a unit. So let me give you some examples. Here's a physical one, standing or sitting. This is, seems very simple, but in fact, when you sit, there are a lot of forces that act on you, and your body counteracts those forces in such a way that you're able to maintain your posture. So tragically, the other day, a friend of mine who has muscular dystrophy was just sitting on a couch. This reminds me of it. And she was just sitting on a couch, and then she just fell over. The reason is that she's lost the ability to fluently carry out the assembled routine that you take for granted by just sitting there. So standing, walking, drinking is a more a complex example. But there are also some mental actions which are of this kind. So looking, hearing, listening, reading, understanding. There are a whole bunch of things that you do. So reading is a nice example because if you've taught an infant or a child to read, this child has to put together these letters one by one to sound out the word, but then you do it so fluently at this stage. So you've got this assembled routine down. You just pick up a book and read. The child has to do all the letters one by one. It doesn't mean that you're not doing the letters one by one. You are doing the letters one by one, but you're able to put it together into this one act, which you will as a unit. That's an assembled routines. So these are intuitively simple, but actually very complex. So assembled, the brain has to coordinate, it has to time, it has to control each of these acts in order to get you to do this simple thing that you do. So these assembled routines may be innate, breathing, walking. They could be developmentally learned, walking and talking. But interestingly enough, they can be instructionally learned. So skilled athletic performance, reading are examples of those, right? So they can be physical, walking, or mental as well, and all of these things. All right, so here's my claim that discriminative savoring, which is different, by the way, than just gulping your chicken soup down. But I want to distinguish between eating and drinking on the one hand and savoring on the other. So discriminative savoring is a learned mental, it's learned, it's mental, or perceptual if you wish. It's an assembled routine. So Kozma's chicken soup, to discriminatively savor it, and not just consume it for nutrition, but savor it, is to attentively discriminate flavor components. So this demands a whole bunch of component acts. There's the texture, you're aware of the texture, you're aware also of the chickeny taste of it, but if you're at a Seder, you're aware of the hint of parsnip, well cloaked by onion and dill, that, which I think is so non-standard for chicken soup. All right. So assembled routines are facilitated by the accompanying pleasure of the sort that I'm talking about. So think of being on a plane, you're cramped, you can hardly move, you're really uncomfortable, but you're reading this great book, right? Even in these difficult circumstances, the pleasure of reading the book carries you through the reading. It helps you read. It helps you ignore or not be aware of all the horrible things that EasyJet has, or whatever airline you're flying, has imposed upon you. So, and you can read late at night, you don't fall asleep, so on and so forth, right? But think of doing exactly the same thing, except that you have a pile of student essays in front of you that you have to grade by the end of the flight, right? So that is, the displeasure of doing that completely disrupts what you are doing. So this is an illustration of the fact that pleasure motivates and sustains and facilitates this difficult assembled routine of reading the book. The book might be a very, very tough one, but nonetheless you can do that. So additionally, they're motivated by facilitating pleasure. So facilitating pleasure is not just a consequence of doing it, it's part of your agency in doing it. It's part of how you do something. It's not just an effect of the complex activity. So think again of discriminative savoring. If you're enjoying the chicken soup, it's much easier to pay the kind of attention to it that reveals the hint of parsnip. But if you hate the soup, if the oily texture puts you off, right, then it's not easy to pay the attention to it that you want to do. Okay, so here we have an actively coordinated composite activity. It produces facilitating pleasure. Now, that's been noticed by Rolf Reber, the psychologist in Oslo, I believe, and Benzer, Nanai, beloved of all of us. So this forward causal chain has been noticed by them. And there's a sort of but what I want to say is that there's a backward causal chain as well. Benzer notices part of that backward chain. He notices that facilitating pleasure motivates you to continue going. But what I want to say is that it motivates, sustains, and facilitates, makes it easier for you to do what you do. It releases your assembled routine. So it's a self-reinforcing loop. There's a loop that comes out of that activity, causes the pleasure, and then flows back into the activity, motivating and facilitating it. So it's, as I said earlier, it's subjectively positively valenced. You like it. A state that accompanies and helps activate this routine, and it's a state that reinforces the activity that it comes out of. All right, so aesthetic pleasure for me is a form of facilitating pleasure, as I've been hinting all along. And the assembled routine in question is mental engagement with an object. So the thesis is aesthetic pleasure is facilitating pleasure for maintaining mental engagement with an object, right? So it's facilitating pleasure for a particular type of assembled routine. That assembled routine is mental engagement with an object. So here's my second claim, that discriminative savoring is mental engagement with flavor, and pleasure in discriminative savoring facilitates the learned mental assembled routine of discriminative savoring. Right. So that's the claim that I want to make. So on that, by the way, it should be relatively obvious that even in a humble case like the chicken soup, there is discriminative savoring. The pleasure that you take in it is aesthetic because discriminative savoring itself is mental engagement, and the pleasure is reinforcing that type of mental engagement. Okay, but there's this oddity about it. And this oddity is not, I just call it not, it's not unique to this case. I'm sure you'll be able to think of other cases where it's the same thing. Discriminative savoring happens side by side with non-discriminative savoring. And what do I mean by that? I mean, you may discriminatively savor this chicken soup, but you might also gulp it. It's very pleasant, right? So it's pretty pleasant to eat chicken soup, and the immediate pleasure of it tends to swamp discriminative savoring. So you take this, it's delicious, great. Who cares about the parsnip, right? So, discriminative savoring, the kind of savoring that reveals the hint of parsnip, right, is it is sort of swamped, so to speak, by non-discriminative savoring. It's sort of unstable because it tends to revert, in most cases, to non-discriminative savoring. So there are two objects of aesthetic enjoyment that exist side by side. One's a proper part of the other, and the enjoyment of the part tends to displace enjoyment of the whole. The rich, unctuous gestalt of chicken soup tends to push the hint of parsnip off stage. So you have to consciously maintain your own non-discriminative savoring. It's easy for the pleasure of the first to displace discriminative savoring of the second. So I'm claiming that that's not standardly the case in artworks. It's not standardly the case in artworks because discriminative appreciation of artworks is what gets you off the ground in doing that. So think of reading poetry, for example. You have to be in a certain frame of mind in order to read poetry. You have to be discriminative about the way you read it. It's not that there's some lower level of gross pleasure, right, that it tends to be swamped by. On the other hand, think of erotic art. Erotic art, regrettably, is swamped by the gross erotic pleasure of engaging with it if you're of that disposition. Okay. So it's not unusual in itself, but it's things like this that makes the hint of parsnip art. Okay, so to my theory of cultural learning, that's the last section of my, or the last conceptual piece of this puzzle. This thing, I want to recall the psychological idea of reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning is this very simple pattern. You want to teach a dog to do something, you reward it when it starts to do that. So you want to make it jump through a fiery hoop. Then when it comes near the hoop, you give it a treat. Then you give it a treat when it comes nearer, and then finally you dangle the treat on the other side. At least I'm told this is the way it's done. So this is reinforcement learning. The dog does something at random, and when it's what you want it to do, you reward it, right? And then that increases the probability that it will do that again. So manner learning is just a variety of reinforcement learning, that if an action is being performed in a certain manner, is rewarded by pleasure more so than other ways of performing that very action, then the likelihood of performing it in this manner in future increases. So there are many ways of mentally engaging with an object. Some being pleasurable relative to others are reinforced relative to others. And this is the basis for manner learning. So you have to do this mental engagement in a certain way in order to maximize your pleasure. So you learn by pleasure to mentally engage with something in a way that pleasurably self-reinforces mentally engaging with that thing in that way. I keep doing this sort of repetitive structure of the thing just to emphasize how it's a self-reinforcing loop. Now, culture uses manner learning in a specific way with respect to art. So in any culture, certain pleasure-facilitating forms of aesthetic engagement are known and disseminated. So when you read poetry, I mean, it's an example because it comes so unnaturally to me as a person. You're told to do it in a certain way. You're told to notice certain meters, certain rhyming patterns, certain imagery of what is being said, and so on. So if you read Shakespeare's sonnets as if they were a New York Times article, you will get zero pleasure out of them. In fact, you'll be rather puzzled by what the hell is going on. But if you notice the meter, you notice the rhyming pattern, the way you were taught to do in high school, then it becomes a more reinforced pleasure. So in any culture, certain pleasure-facilitating forms of aesthetic engagement are known and disseminated. In those cultures, works are produced that will produce pleasure when engaged with in these ways. So somebody produces the work, and the work produces pleasure, provided that you engage with it in a manner that you were taught to engage with it in that culture. So culture learning in a culture, learning in a culture how to produce and consume works of art for pleasurable engagement. But there are two parties to this. There's the creator, and the creator assumes that the work will be consumed in a particular way, and then there's the consumer who agrees to consume it in that way in order to get pleasure out of it. If either of them foul up, then there's something that goes wrong. So an artist creates a work of art intending to produce facilitating pleasure engagement if mentally engaged with in a certain manner. The consumer engages with it in a certain manner, assuming that it will produce enjoyment. And the culture shared by artist and consumer enables coordination between the two. It's a game of coordination. And a work of art is one that has in the background a culture-specific form of coordination between artist and consumer. I want to say that's a characteristic of a work of art, that there's some coordination between, a culture-specific form of coordination between artist and consumer. So here's my shot at saying what denotation or reference is about. A feature F of an artwork is denotative when discriminating and attending to F is part of the culture-specific coordination between artist and consumer. So F is not enjoyed simply for its intrinsic qualities. The artist intends for it to produce enjoyment when it's consumed in a particular manner. The consumer consumes it for that. So it's not the intrinsic qualities, but the culture-based coordinative qualities. So they're part of a cultural understanding. And F denotes F because the artist creates F and the consumer notices F as a part of that coordination. Right? So, the aesthetic versus the artistic. Aesthetic enjoyment is pleasure that facilitates a cognitively difficult act of mental engagement, but art is an artwork is an object that is made for aesthetic enjoyment, but given a background of coordinated expectations between creator and consumer. So there's something more in art than aesthetic enjoyment. That more is the cultural coordination, the coordination that's produced by culture. So a creative cook incorporates subtleties of flavor, assuming that a consumer will discriminate and attain to those against the background of certain expectations and assumptions. Now, some parts of the flavor profile are pleasing as a simple result of exposure. Other parts of the profile are pleasing, at least in part, because they, as it were, make a statement against the background of a culinary culture. So maybe the schmaltzy unctuousness of chicken soup is of the first kind, that is, you just get to like it by having it. You don't need any cultural expectation. But the subdued hint of parsnip well cloaked by onion and dill is of the second kind, I would claim. And maybe you disagree with that, but we can find many other examples. Right? So the latter is denotative and exemplary because it relies on its pleasurable effect, at least in part on expectations created by the Jewish culinary culture that I was so dismally unaware of. So, food is a flavorful object that exemplifies certain flavors, and appreciating it as an artwork substantially depends on recognizing it, that it exemplifies those flavors. But exemplification is important here. However, like some other sensual creation, food leans very heavily on the kind of appeal that depends on the intrinsic qualities of flavor. So, what makes it art is the culture-specific features of it, but it's not a defect in a novel and a poem that you can't enjoy it in a non-discriminative, non-culturally based manner. But it is a defect in food. So if the chicken soup doesn't have flavor, if it's sort of flavorless and bland, then the fact that it has a hint of parsnip is not going to save it. You can't enjoy it. But it's not a defect of Madama Butterfly that it just completely shatters you, right? So the whole thing is at a second order kind of level. All right, conclusions. So food is the object of discriminative savoring that depends on mere exposure in all cultures. Thus, it is the object of non-artistic aesthetic appreciation. But all culinary cultures create expectations that creative cooks can exploit for discriminative, culture-specific discriminative savoring. Enjoyment that requires knowledge of the specific expectations of that culture, and thus food can be art. However, it's an unusual art inasmuch as the former kind of non-artistic enjoyment is essential and perhaps dominates.
So let me start by trying. What I try to do here is to clarify a couple of things that were a little bit complicated or might raise some objections, if not they are not properly characterized. The first is regard to exemplification. Exemplifications play a clear, a fundamental role in the theory, and exemplification is defined as the symbolic relation in which an object both possesses a property and refers to it. So what Martin is attempting to do is to show that food art can be an integrated art, and this requires the exemplification. So an item with a function other than being a work of art is integrately an art. An item with a function other than being a work of art is integrately an artwork, and I'm just copy and pasting from the slides. It exemplifies this other function, and appreciating it as an artwork substantially depends on A. So here I have a doubt. So I think that all the things that are usually called minor arts, and I'm not that interested in this distinction, I think that they satisfy this. So there is a tendency from my side to disagree, and the case of the airport is really one case in which this thing is satisfied. So here's an example of a wonderful, the Madrid airport. So it is part of appreciating these to know that it's an airport. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know how this discussion, so at least it seems to me that it's part of appreciating the piece, that it fulfills the function. And if not, I don't know how to, I'm just pumping some intuitions in some cases. I'm moving forward. The idea, Martin's idea is that he wonders whether food can be an art in virtue of exemplifying flavor. So he focuses in flavor, and I think it's very interesting. I agree with many of the things that you were presenting. So here I just intend to throw some challenges to open the discussion. So here is, flavor is a feature of appreciative attention within the theory, and one thing that is required is to see whether flavor can be the notative. And he, yeah, yes, it can. So here are some conditions. So he claims that aesthetic appreciation has to support, it's something that supports cognitively difficult mental engagement with an object, and it is this aesthetic pleasure that facilitates these kind of difficult, but scare quotes, engagement. And in some cases, this discriminative savoring, the faculty of discriminative savoring is something that is learned in these routines, and it's something from which we benefit from these aesthetic pleasures. So, and here is the proposal, what I take to be the core of the proposal, and there are a couple of things that I'm not sure, or I fail to completely understand the role that they play. So the first thing is this thing that you read up, that a feature F of an artwork is the notative. So this is, we need to first determine whether flavor can be the notative, if I properly follow. When discriminating and attending to this, in this case the flavor is part of the culture-specific coordination between the artist and consumer. So, and then two things have to be fulfilled. So aesthetic enjoyment is pleasure that facilitates a cognitively difficult act of mental engagement with an object. And an artwork is an object that is made for aesthetic enjoyment given coordinated expectation. So what is required in this engagement? So what is socially required? So here is an example in which, so what happened with animals? So they are able to make savoring discrimination based mostly not on taste but on olfaction, and I can be the producer of a product which is sell for those dogs, making them more appealing. Would that count as an artwork? So how this thing is blocked? So I don't know, my intuition is that it wouldn't, but if it is, it's also not a big problem. But I want to, it mostly helps to understand how these two conditions are satisfied, because it seems that the dog is savoring, and I'm creating a product that allows him to keep eating, and yeah, so there is a coordinated expectation. So now I want to also to understand the role that this discrimination plays. So here is one case of one of those Tramdoil, and the reason why I picked that one is that so that I am sure that it satisfies the second condition. So given the coordinated expectations, I'm playing with the coordinated expectations, if I properly understood, to give you something that is different. Now, imagine that there is only one flavor there, so there is no discrimination to be found. So it seems that in the theory, discrimination is relevant. In all the examples, discrimination was relevant, but sometimes there is only one flavor. I might not even be able to recognize it in any sense. It's taste, and it just simply doesn't taste as I expected. So it seems that conditions 2 is fulfilled. Condition 1 is I really like it, so I keep eating. So I would like to ask you what you think of those cases, just to understand the role that discrimination plays. Oh, here's another example. So as I was coming here, I was talking with Sam about this. He mentioned, this is Ferran Adrià, this is from El Bully No Ticket, I said probably. But he mentioned that he didn't like olive. He doesn't like olives, and nevertheless, he appreciated this dish. So it's not something that he likes it or that contributes to helping him keep doing the activity, because it was not something that he was appreciating. But nevertheless, it seems that he was appreciating the art. And this one, there was one slide missing, so that was I don't know why it's missing, but in which there is one dish created by Aduriz that I mentioned yesterday, which is a rotten apple. So the apple is led to rot, and in order to get some flavors, those flavors are, some people might find it disgusting, but they are complicated, and this is supposed to be a case in which flavor is relevant. So the artist is playing with the expectation, but it's not something pleasurable. So why do we need to have the pleasure there? Nonetheless, I mean, this thing that is not, it's kind of disgusting, contributes to keep you eating, and you eat it and you want to know more, but it doesn't have to be pleasurable. So those are just a couple of questions. I thought it might be, they might be of use to clarify a little bit the view. So thank you.
So I'm completely on board with minor arts being art. Totally on. In fact, that's my whole point, is what I want to do. So in the case of the gorgeous walkway yeah, it says, I'm a walkway. See how nice I am as a walkway. You know, so I'm completely on board with that. I don't think that the thing about architecture, I think, is that not all of it is like that. I mean, the substantial part of it has to do with its being an airport. After all, if that thing didn't, that walkway at Barajas Airport didn't take you to your gate, then you know, it really wouldn't be worthwhile. I mean, making an airport is an extremely complicated thing, right? Because of all of the various functions that have to be performed in it, and appreciating how those functions are, fulfilled may or may not be part of your appreciation of the result. As far as animals are concerned, so my dog anyway just likes to eat. Likes to eat certain things better than other things, and the smell of the things that it likes to eat are a sign to her that she would like that thing rather than something else. But she just wants to put it in her mouth and swallow it. She doesn't want to savor it discriminatively or anything like that. Now, I'm happy to learn that there are some dogs that like to sniff flowers. Oh, that's great. So I would say yes, they are aesthetically appreciating the flower. Now, is that art? No, because when you or I or the dog discriminatively savor the smell of the flower, we are not relying on any cultural expectation that is created, that exists between the creator of the flower, God, and
so I was thinking like making food.
Yeah. So now with food, there's this very interesting example of the rotting apple. So it creates an expectation, and then that So yeah, I have to think more about that. That's a great example. But I do want to note that there's this standard thing in the aesthetics literature about how tragedy can be painful, right? And indeed, it is painful, but you're not going to these very difficult works of tragedy in order to get pain, right? Nobody looks at Hieronymus Bosch in order to see some poor creature being swallowed by some predator. You know, he got all these. That's not. I mean, it would take a sick mind to go to it for that reason. There's certain kinds of pornographic art, no doubt, pornography, which do rely on such things. But there's something higher level which you go there for. It's something to do with how that thing is presented, the significance of that thing. And, you know, it's not the pain itself that you're enjoying, hopefully. Rather, it is some bigger, broader message, which, as a philosopher, I would not presume to tell you what that message is, but there's something bigger to it. And that's the thing that you're savoring or enjoying, not just the pain. I hope nobody likes to read just to enjoy scenes of torture and so on and so forth. So similarly, I don't know about the apple. As I say, that's a tough case because one reason why it's tough is that you put it in your mouth and it's rotten, it's disgusting. You want to spit it out. It's, you know, I mean, it's disrupting the discriminative savoring that the artist hoped you'd have from it, and somehow it strikes me as like that's one of the things that's funny about food as art, namely that nonetheless it relies at the bottom on something which is not dependent on a cultural agreement, and in this case that is violated, right? And when it's violated, it's really tough for me to see how exactly it would be art.
This is the slide. So, having questions? Sam?
Yeah, so in the philosophy of literature, there's this debate about interpretation that have different positions, like actual intentionalism, where it depends on the actual intention of the creator, and hypothetical intentionalism, and other positions that are more work-oriented. Yours isn't exactly about that, but there's a kind of parallel where it seems like you emphasize the intention of the creator a lot. And I just wonder if it's prone to kind of similar challenges people have given to actual intentionalism. But here, since this is a food conference, I won't give you a literature example, I won't give you a food example. So the legend of Nashville hot chicken goes like this. This woman, her husband was cheating on her, so he came back, whatever, in the morning. He didn't come back at night, he came back in the morning, so she made some hot chicken. She made some fried chicken, and she put like lots of hot sauce on it to like give him a lot of pain. Like when he bites into it, the thought is like, he'll feel a lot of displeasure. But he didn't. He actually felt a lot of pleasure. He's like, this tastes great. And then thus Nashville hot chicken was born. So the legend goes. Let's take it as like something in the vicinity is true. Right? There seems to be a non-coordination between the artist and the consumer, and there seems to be, I don't know, I guess I just don't want to tie the aesthetic value of Nashville hot chicken too much to the intention of the creator. Right? I think there's something that's important about those.
So I'm just going to take you at your word of that story, right? So let's not contest the details of the story. So I think there is food which is pleasing because of its intrinsic qualities and not because of any culturally agreed upon thing. So let's suppose, disgusting to me though this sounds, let's suppose that this chicken is actually pleasing. So, I mean, I feel I need to contest at least that part of your story, but It's just there. It's like a flower in the garden. It's something that you like to consume, and so that you can aesthetically enjoy it, but it's not a work of art because on your story it does not depend on any convention or cultural set of expectations.
So the notion of work of art is necessarily actual intentionalist.
So a work of art is something which, to me, is produced with the intention that the audience should enjoy it, but that the audience should enjoy it when it is consumed in a certain manner.
Right. But it depends on the creator's actual intentions about how those things are to be consumed.
No. I mean, it might completely fail as a work of communication, right? The communication succeeds if the creator's intentions coincide in a happy way with the consumer's, but it might, you know.
I just mean that it depends on the actual creator's actual intentions. Like that actual person who created it and the actual intention.
What depends on that?
Whether it's a work of art on your view.
Oh, I see. It's a work of art if it can be, if the enjoyable consumption of it is dependent on those conventions, not on the actual intention of the creator. But the actual intention of the creator comes in at a different stage of that game.
Okay.
Sorry.
So I think this is a little bit related to the same question, and I'm just curious if you're really committed to talking about works of art, or if you're talking about things that are aesthetic, because it seems to me like a lot of what you're talking about are aesthetic pleasures, but I wouldn't commit as works of art. And I mean, I think it's questionable about food, but the airport, for example, I think is good, right? The airports that were built in the 60s were all utilitarian, right? And so as we have reconfigured air travel, they have become much more aesthetically pleasing all over the world. And there's lots and lots of examples of really interesting spaces that have been created in very, very different ways. I don't know if I would go so far as to call any of them art, and I don't know why an example...
Sorry, any of the modern ones you wouldn't call?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Aesthetically pleasing, absolutely, or aesthetic, but I don't know why. I guess I don't know why the commitment to calling things art and not just aesthetic.
So I think that art goes beyond the aesthetic. So Karen Kosma, by the way, does not think that. So it's a position that you could take that is just a continuum between the aesthetic and the work of art, and maybe that's your position. That's not my position. My position is that you can make things for the aesthetic enjoyment of somebody, and that would not by itself constitute then those objects as artworks. They are artworks when they essentially rely on some culturally specific. By culturally specific, I don't mean geographically specific, but culturally specific in there is some set of expectations which stands behind the thing. So as far as the way you were telling the story about the airport, which I don't buy, by the way, but the way you were telling the story about the airport, yeah, they're not artworks.
Well, I don't think chicken soup is ever art either, though.
Yeah, that's what you think, but I disagree.
Yeah. Okay.
Because I think that there are aspects of chicken soup. That's why that's the reason why I took a very humble example like chicken soup, because what I want to say is that humble example, which in typical terms, when I make a chicken soup, I just mean it to be aesthetically pleasing. That is to say, I mean it to be enjoyable, to be discriminate. But a creative chef like Jose, when he makes chicken soup, he builds into it a lot of things about flavor which are dependent on your cultural expectations. So that's what I think is the difference between me and I think I'm a decent cook, right? So that's the difference between me and him, that what I do is intended to please you even when you're a discriminative savorer, right? Not just the cuckolded wife, But when you're discriminative, so I pride myself on producing things which a discriminative savorer would appreciate. But he does something much more demanding and interesting, namely that he is exploiting a bunch of expectations, and you say, oh, that's extraordinary because that does this or that, you know. So that's what I'm saying. So I'm not putting art on the same continuum as aesthetic enjoyment.
There is a short follow-up.
Just a finger on this. One thing I find, and this is not a criticism so much, it's just an observation I find interesting. You inherit an interesting challenge that George Dickey had. I mean, so there's a vaguely institutional aspect to it. It's essentially cultural. And so like a classic objection to Dickey is the isolated artist. And he's got all sorts of moves, and people go back and forth about that. And so it's interesting that you have, that your account faces the same issue. Not that it's necessarily a deep problem, but it is an interesting institutional flavor to your account.
Yeah, so there is an institutional element in my thing, but I do require that institutional element be used to create enjoyment, and Dickey did not require that.
Absolutely, I said there's
Right?
an element, but that is an interesting thing that came out of the discussion.
Yeah.
It's more the cultural embeddedness, institutional stuff, than the intentional stuff that I think is interesting, I think.
Alessandro.
So it seems to me that the denotative aspect of artwork or objects of aesthetical appreciation can go either way. So it can either add to the aesthetic experience,
The denotative?
yeah,
Yeah.
or take away from it. And so I will give an example in which it seems to take away from it. A few years ago, there was a debate among software designers about something called skeuomorphism. So skeuomorphism is the property of a program, like a graphic interface program, in which the app tries to emulate a physical object. So for instance, I have a Notepad app that tries hard to look like a physical Notepad app. And this was initially the way software went on mobile devices. So the iPhone initially was designed like that, to look like a physical object. So you had the Notepad app that looked like a Notepad. And so what happened is that a few years ago, software designers said, okay, this is really terrible. I mean, we should just stop doing this. It doesn't play any role. It just looks silly, etc. And I think it's kind of interesting because it's one of those few cases in which software designers actually had some aesthetic awareness of what they were doing. And so again, so it seems to me that the denotative aspect is kind of orthogonal to how artistic or non-artistic something is. And I take software design to be able to be a piece of art as any other piece of design.
Yes, and the only place where I have a question on what you said, and genuinely it's a question, is do you think that they made the Notepad app to look like a notepad because they wanted to be artistic? Or because they thought it was easier to use that way?
No, they thought that initially it was just a pragmatic aspect, but
Right.
then the aesthetical one arose. So they realized, look, that this doesn't really play any role, and we think that
Right.
it just looks better if it doesn't look like a physical.
Yeah, so it was the discarding of this that was the aesthetic,
Yes,
not
exactly.
not the adoption of it. The
Exactly.
adoption of it was supposedly pragmatic. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So my point is that this is one of those cases in which the denotative aspect goes against.
But why do you think it was denotative? That's the part that I'm not getting.
Oh, because you have something which is then.
Notepad just says write on this, and they made it like a notepad because it was easier to write on.
Well, I would have
Take
thought that, I would have thought that this tries to say, hey, I'm a notepad. Look, I'm made of paper, and I have the color of paper, and I'm three-dimensional, even if it doesn't really have any of those features. So,
I must be I am a very literal person, but I never thought of it that way. Okay, but yeah, maybe that's, yeah, if that's true, then I accept that it was a bad use of the demon. I mean, of course there's going to be bad art, right? I mean, it's a bad art. There's lots of painfully self-conscious, self-referential art or not writing, right? Yeah. And yeah, if the author had been less pretentious, then it would have been aesthetically more enjoyable. Yeah. So that's definitely.
So we have three more questions. I was being generous, but people started to raise their hands, so I apologize to the people that I lost. So I'm going to try to keep the conversation as one question and one reply. So, and sorry for not being fair in my distribution.
So this is about exemplification, and if I understood your view correctly, you think that the exemplification of flavor is dependent on culturally driven coordination of expectations, right? And I'm wondering if this really tells the whole story. Like, I agree with you that, for example, in the chicken soup case, exemplification may be driven by this cultural coordination. But I'm not sure. I think there can be exemplification that doesn't rely on that. So here's an example. So like a few months ago, I was in a restaurant in Pittsburgh. I was hungry. I wasn't wanting to like get just a quick meal. I wanted to enjoy my food. So I went to this restaurant. I had an omelet, and it had some pickled peppers on the side. And I tried the pickled peppers, and first of all, I noticed, oh, this is delicious. But then I also noticed, what an intense pepper flavor. Like, I had never tasted peppers that were this peppery. And this made me think, like, this is a case, or this is, I think, a good candidate for a case in which these peppers were exemplifying pepper flavor. But I don't see anything that is culturally driven about this exemplification. It was solely the preparation technique of the peppers, like the fact maybe some special pickling technique, but the intense pepper flavor is what I think makes these peppers good candidates for exemplification of pepper flavor.
I don't know whether you're using exemplification in a slightly different sense than Korsmeyer was, or Nelson Goodman was. So the way you're using exemplification is like, that's the best example of something. No, you weren't. You were not using it that way. In that case, I guess I'm a little, what? So you think that by intensifying the peppery nature of the pepper, the chef made the pepper say, I am a pepper.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. No, that's no. I that's plausible. I don't find that. It's a nice example. Thanks.
Yes, I was a bit surprised by the role of expectations coming so late and being distinctive of the art aspect of the accounts, given the abundant literature there is on the role of expectations for a very basic sensory pleasure. So it seems like you had this oiliness of the soup has nothing to do with cultural expectations, and then the cultural expectations were all about the parsnip, kind of. But we know, like, if you serve a chicken soup to someone, the fact that they expect it to be a chicken soup will be part of the sensory enjoyment already. And if you serve, there's this famous experiment where a frozen mousse, salmon mousse, was served as a salty ice cream, and people hated it because ice cream. Yeah, that's because the expectation is that the cultural expectation of an ice cream, it needs to be sweet. So if you give me something salty that looks like an ice cream, then I feel it's disgusting. So it really interferes with my sensory pleasure. Whenever, if you have a banana that looks like a potato and I serve it to you, and then you find that disgusting as a potato, and so on and so forth. So all these expectations about ways of food needing to be presented and the cooked and served is already very basic for the non-artistic part. So what?
Well, why do you say that that's non-artistic though? I mean, that's the part that I.
Well, therefore, there is nothing like you were trying to say the oiliness is the sensory, non-aesthetic enjoyment.
Yeah, so I was saying that the oiliness is something which. So I get where we're slightly on a disagreement. So I think that the oiliness is something you can enjoy simply by experiencing it enough, right? So I think that
it's expectation free.
No, I'll come to expectations in a second. So you'll have some expectations. So roughly, Hume's notion of sufficient exposure will take care of the oiliness part of the chicken soup. So it might be an expectation because you've had chicken soup often enough, but it doesn't. So there's something in a chicken soup with a hint of parsnip in it, which says, I am a Jewish chicken soup, like me for that. And then you can play with that. So I think art comes in the second rather than the first. But I'm not saying that there are no expectations.
We have 2 more questions,
yeah.
Sorry, so just to...
Okay.
Because we can continue, and in order to hear all the questions,
yeah.
as you please, 1 minute question, 1 minute reply, so
okay.
we can hear all the questions. No, we have like 2 minutes.
Okay, so I was wondering about this idea that aesthetic appreciation supports cognitively difficult engagement, particularly about the cognitive difficulty bit. Mm-hmm. Because it seems to me there are certain art forms which can be aesthetically appreciated, taken pleasure in which case this kind of exercise of cognitive effort is almost improper. So if you think of ambient music, for instance, like Brian Eno's music for airports, where I think you start to listen to it, and you start to distinguish what's happening there. It's actually you don't find anything there, but actually it's mostly about succumbing to it in a way. And maybe opposite side very quickly, like grindcore music, like Napalm Death has this 4-second song where they scream, "You suffer, but why?" very quickly. And I mean, it's mostly this kind of visceral response that you get from it, but it's quite clever actually, in a way, and it's still aesthetically appreciable.
Yeah. So I do discuss cases like that with some others. So I talk about reverie. So I don't think that attention needs to be a part of the. I mean, it usually is, but doesn't have to be. So I think I can accommodate cases like that, but not in 1 minute.
I made a mistake with the time. I thought we would finish at 1:45, and I have been called attention by the moderator of the moderator. So we have 5 more minutes.
Oh, great. Okay. So that doesn't make it cognitively easy.
Sorry.
Right. I mean, the fact that there are certainly forms of art. They're not not the usual forms of art, but there's some forms of art where reverie is important and you're supposed to just float away. I think Coleridge's poem about in Xanadu de Kubla Khan, the stately pleasure dome decree, that one. I think you're supposed to sort of float away and become stoned when you listen to that poem. So you're supposed to
stoner music.
Yeah. You're supposed to disattend in a certain kind of way. But there's something that doesn't mean it's cognitively easy, right? I mean, there are a lot of things which are cognitively difficult, like just the one that you just mentioned, the 4-second.
It's like 1.3 seconds.
1.3 now.
Okay, my bad.
Yeah, and I don't see why that's cognitively easy. And there's nothing that's cognitively easy in these situations, right? I mean, remember, I started out with something that people think is very simple, standing, right? But it isn't. So it's a miracle of biological design that somebody can stand.
Maybe this distinction between it's difficult to come to the position where you can appreciate this, but when you're at that position, then it's in a way easy. It seems at least. And
Yeah, it's an assembled routine, which I agree with that.
Okay. I guess I wanted to ask about whether you need to depend on exemplification so much, because like that example or those examples where you're interested in experiences where it's not mere sensation, where you're sort of gripped by wanting to do justice to this thing, and I just don't see why exemplification would be the only way to do it. But I did want to sneak in the chicken soup, too. I wondered about what we heard from Aaron, I take it, is that you're supposed to taste a hint of parsnip. Or that would be a very normal thing. Standard? Okay.
It's a Waltonian standard.
It's a Waltonian, okay. So then I was unclear, like, how could attending to that... I'm just worried attending to that isn't part of this kind of engagement you're interested in, because it's just too easy, or it's too normal, or it's just like what you're supposed to be doing, and it couldn't maybe rise to flaunting itself or engaging you.
So sorry,
I may be misunderstanding the case. But.
So no, I just missed the central point of what you want to say about the example. That it's too easy, you said right at the end.
Right, I guess I thought the hint of parsnip was supposed to be the thing you could exercise discriminative savoring with. And I just thought, well, if that's what you're always tasting, when you know you're tasting Jewish chicken soup, it wouldn't be all that.
Oh, I see.
If you,
So the way that Korsmeyer puts it, I took from her that though it was a completely standard element of a Jewish chicken soup, that nonetheless it was, the way she described it, I got the impression that, you know, you'd have to be a good taster at paying attention in order to, because, you know, there are plenty of things which are very familiar, right, and which you can just slip into not picking up on the subtle aspects of it. And that's how I took the way that she described, the way she described it, I took it, but maybe I'm wrong. That may not have been her intention, but I just took it to be that way. So I don't think it's that easy, even though it's completely standard. Yeah.
Okay. So then that is interesting, this notion of the standard features and the coordination within a culture that facilitates, like, knowing what to do with a work of art. Sorry. Like many works of art that we really value are the ones that disrupt those expectations. Yes. So I'm also curious how you incorporate that into the...
Yeah, so a creative chef would use that expectation of parsnip to, would disrupt that somehow, right? I mean, so you are expecting that, and she puts in some additional thing, right? Which, I mean, you have to be a creative chef to know what that additional thing would be, right? Which somehow riffs on the parsnip without being the parsnip. That's the idea that I have.
So we have 2 more minutes. If there is any further question.
I think my question is more rhetoric. I don't know, whatever. It's because of your use of the notion denotative, you know, and when you say that, you know, a feature is denotative, I don't know if you are stipulating the meaning of a technical term and you're calling it denotative, or you actually think that you are actually, you know, telling us when a feature is denotative, in what we already know it means to denote, because it seems such an odd thing to say about what we commonly think about denote. So. Yeah. But if it's the first one, it's kind of like tricky to use a word that is so heavily charged, so theoretically charged, to something that seems to be technical. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. So I think I could do without it. It was just because it was just because I was taking this notion from Korsmeyer, who takes it from
Good.
Goodman, that I thought I would just go along with it. And right at the end, you know, the agreement between the creator and the consumer, right? I mean, that's a sort of a Gricean
that's what
little notion of.
Then you also talk about communication.
That's right. That's right.
But then
So I probably, you know, if I were ever to write this up for publication, if the bosses were to deem it worthy of such an honor, I would try to play that down a little bit. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, you join me in thanking Mohan.
Discussion. And now there is a, so yeah, my talk is about normativity. You know, it's I think that food is a very interesting space to which to approach questions about normativity, because it's a space where we always have to make decisions about what we ought to have, what we ought to cook, what we ought to order, what we ought to, you know, just there's a very human space in where to talk about where do our decisions come from, what structures them, right? There's a nice quote, very recent, about that says, "It's beyond strange that so many humans are clueless about how they should feed themselves. Every wild species on the planet knows how to do it. Presumably ours did too, before our oversized brains found new ways to complicate things. Now we're the only species that can be baffled about the right way to eat. I personally have a very, very hard time ordering at restaurants. I know a lot of people do. And I have a lot of hard time, you know, deciding what to cook every week. And I'm puzzled about these things. Even though actually today's talk starts at KFC. Because I started writing it because a few days, actually months ago, I started writing this, I went to KFC. Not very willingly, mind you. My nephew, it was his birthday, and he was coming to city. He lives in a place very, very far up in the hills. And he wanted to come to Mexico City. And so like, yeah, where do you want to go? And he said, oh, I want to go to KFC. And we were like, are you sure you wouldn't prefer going, you know, to Six Flags or something like that? No, I want to go to KFC, right? And we were, oh my God, okay, yeah. So we went. And, but a lot of people do, like a lot of people go to KFC. It's a huge chain. And a lot of people seem to like it a lot. All over the world, actually. And as you know, some countries, it's really, 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 really big. And there have been some empirical studies about why, right? Why people want to go to KFC. There's a couple of papers from the early 2000s, and they found that, well, people go to KFC, literally to KFC, because it's perceived as cheap, fast, convenient, tasty, and other reasons. Like it's familiar, people know it. It's somewhere where there's lots of advertising, it's very well known, so it's very easy to just say, let's go to KFC. I'm not so interested in why people go to KFC as to why we were so appalled by the idea of going to KFC with my nephew. That's really puzzling. That's really, really interesting. And I know a lot of you also were like, oh my God, I'm sorry this happened to you. And and I bet that if I ask you why were you so appalled about going to KFC, you're going to go like, I don't know, there are heaps of criteria we could go. You maybe will go some aesthetic criteria that KFC food clearly doesn't satisfy, right? It doesn't seem to express any masterful technique, be exemplar, denote genius. All these things that a lot of people think food should be, or at least would be the kind of things that would normatively push us in one direction or another when we have to decide where to go to get some food, right? There are content, well, I mean, these are my names, but you know this, especially if you are in this conference. People talk about criteria as, you know, does it stand as the peak achievement of a culinary tradition? Does it challenge a canonical way of cooking, eating, serving, etc.? Does it display any hermeneutic virtue? You know, here this means like how informative is taste to what it contains, how well defined are the flavors, etc. Also, as Paloma and Aaron mentioned yesterday, there are a lot of political values that come in place when we decide what to eat, because
as we know, our choices on food stand within a socio-economic structure, a material structure that has very important effects that have to be evaluated under political and ethical criteria and moral, mostly bioethical consideration. And also, as there's going to be a talk in a few minutes, our food choices have very deep meanings, right? There's some symbolic significance of your choice, like authenticity, Mexicanity, identity, and things like that. And of course, lots of religious taboos. You know, there's all these criteria that can be easily identified in the way people decide what to eat that go beyond those very early criteria that people use to go to KFC. I like this list. I didn't come up with this list, actually. I borrowed it from one of our colleagues, Sebastián Escala. He was here, and he came up with this list, and I thought, oh, this is a great list. Actually, I think it's very, very thorough. And one of the interesting things about this list is that it was a conference on normativity, and it was not about food. It was about art. You know, actually, these criteria in his talk were the criteria we use to judge works of art, right? And that I found that very, very interesting, right? That the way we talk about food is very similar to the way we talk about art when we consider normative criteria. At least from the normative standpoint, there are very strong analogies between art and food. So that's where my idea came from. I thought, okay, so I guess that means that one way that we can approach one of the key questions, or perhaps the key question of this conference, which is in what sense or whether food, especially food preparation, is art, is from this perspective, as whether in order to understand certain aspects of food normativity, it's helpful to conceive of food as an art. Right. So that's what I'm going to try to do. What I'm going to try to do here is I'm not going to broach the question of whether food is art like we just heard, which would be like to try to find something like sufficient criteria and then see if food satisfies it, which there's nothing wrong with that. Good way of going. But this is going to be something different. I am more of, my background is mostly in a very cognitive-based philosophy of science. So I am very close to like the work of people like Edouard Machary or Sergio Martinez, who are like inheritors of a Quinean view of concepts. So the idea here is that I'm going to try to see whether it's a good idea to think of food as art in order to explain our food practices, in particular to explain certain aspects of food normativity. So the idea is to look at the explanatory value of considering food art. So we're going to start with some empirical data about how we decide what to eat, and then see whether the hypothesis of thinking of food as an art help us shed light on that phenomenon. And I mentioned Machary and Martinez, but especially Martinez, because Martinez has a very clear theory about when we should, a normative theory of when we should decide whether a phenomenon fits under a concept. And he says, you know, concepts are, the main function of concepts in our theories is to serve as bridges for cognitive resources, explanatory resources. So a good concept works as long as it helps us bring some resources that we use for some phenomena to shed light on others, right? So we consider it on the same concept if we can use that bridge. So that's what I'm going to try to exhort you here to do, to use art as a bridge to bring some resources that have been developed for the study of certain art forms to the study of food. To be more particular, some way we think about the avant-garde, I'm going to hold that helps us understand the way we talk about the avant-garde also in food. Actually, talk of the avant-garde is very common in food writing in the last decades. And I think it might be non-metaphorically. Actually, there are good reasons to think that avant-garde food is bona fide avant-garde. But of course, avant-garde is said in many ways. So a particular kind of avant-garde I'm going to be interested, which is musical avant-garde, which is, if you know me, it would not be that surprising because that's what I know, right? So the main conclusion, or the main claim I'm trying to try to make, is that the avant-garde is an anti-populist normative stance that manifests itself in contemporary cuisine in a very similar way as it manifests in a bona fide art form, which is music, right? I'm going to say that if we focus on this aspect of avant-garde, that it is a normative stance and it is anti-populist, then we're going to find this manifesting in a very similar way in food as it does in music, or as it has been happening in music in the last century. And what I mean by the normative stance is that if we look back at Sebastian Lomély's list of all these criteria that we use to decide what to eat, what to prepare, what to order, they are not atomistic, right? It's not that, you know, if we choose to value environmental concerns, then we still have the choice to, I don't know, take other hermeneutic values in stride or not, and then we have a wide variety of normative stance we can take towards food. Actually, empirical evidence shows that these criteria cluster, right? So some values actually commonly come with others. They are not atomistic. And that is what I think could be very well explained by adopting seriously the hypothesis that the culinary avant-garde is literally an avant-garde. And for that, I am going to base myself on the work of Georgina Born, who wrote this beautiful book. I love this book. I haven't finished it. It's huge. But and also because it's so full of ideas. You know, I just go through the page like, oh my God, this is great. I want to keep thinking about it. And this is a book about the musical avant-garde, right? But as I was reading it, I was like, I mean, you just change the names of the authors for chefs and things like that, and you get a very good book about contemporary food. Because actually, I think there are very strong similarities. I don't know if she's wrong. She may be wrong. This is an empirical work. She is an ethnographer, so she went and looked at the musicians. I hope she's right, because otherwise my analogy doesn't work. But it's a really nice way to look at the avant-garde. The key hypothesis of the way she thinks of the avant-garde is that what structures debates that have happened in contemporary art in the 20th and 21st century, one of the key questions that structured this debate is the question of what sort, if any, knowledge do we require in order to properly appreciate a work of art? You know, this is a very fundamental aesthetic question. And according to Born, different ways of answering these questions give rise to different avant-garde traditions. So I'm going to repeat this. This is important. The question of how much knowledge and what kind of knowledge should be had in order to properly appreciate a work of art is a question that is key to structure what we understand as the avant-garde in the 20th century. And of course, the very first obvious possible answer is to say that none at all, that there shouldn't be any special knowledge in order to appreciate a work of art, right? Just natural openness and curiosity and just be willing to try it should be good enough. This is what I'm going to call, and here I'm following other people, a populist stance, right? Where you don't need any special knowledge, you don't need to do any special epistemic work. You just are curious enough, you just try, and you realize, oh, this is cool, or no, this sucks, right? And populism is a very well-established tradition in art, and I think it's also very well-established in food. The populist, this is a quote from Armstrong, is worried that that connoisseurs are actually like fooling people, right? That's like the main reason why people are populist. This is just a quote from an aesthetics book, but this is a very common idea. There's a reason why they're populist. Unfortunately, I'm not going to talk about populism, even though it's a fascinating topic, because what I'm more interested is in the different ways there are to be anti-populist. So if you don't think that the answer is no, you don't have to know anything, then what are the other questions available, the answers available? And here, Born argues that there are two very well-defined ways of answering these questions, and that these two well-defined answers give rise to two fairly well-defined avant-garde traditions in music. So she is doing the empirical work in music. This is Udo Casemet's Timepiece for Solo Performers, a very nice musical piece. And what I'm going to argue is that these two ways of answering the question correspond very strongly to two very well-defined also ways of understanding questions about the food avant-garde, about where should cooking go, right? How should we take cooking? What direction should tradition be developed? So what are these two? This is very simple. The first one is that, yes, you need knowledge. This is some guy called Matlin. I said, okay, so he has this theory about primary and secondary attractors, where primary attractors are what make art appeal to the senses, and thus they are essential for the appreciation of art. Many think that at least some of them have universal appeal, and propose that they are genetic and connected to evolution. That's so far so good. The populists would be like, oh, cool. But then you're like, oh, but art is not simply the production of artifacts that can be appreciated this way. Art has another universal characteristic. It has secondary attractors that appeal to connoisseurs. And here comes this word, right? I don't speak French well, so probably I'm going to mispronounce it, or I could use it in Spanish, conocedores. So this kind of characteristic appeal to los conocedores y requieren and require skill levels that demand practice and learning. We just heard about this, about skill and practice and learning a few minutes ago. In so-called high art, according to Matlin, the secondary attractors predominate. So this is a very anti-populist stance, right? You need training. You need to learn in order to properly appreciate high art. This is very... And this is something that is actually also present in a certain kind of food avant-garde. The idea that new food, new cuisine requires learning some skills. Actually, there's a lot of debate of exactly what sort of skills, what sort of knowledge is required, but it's a very widespread idea among many movements, many food movements, that new food requires training, right? Here's a quote from Rachel Loudon, and you can see how this echoes a lot of Matlin's work. People have to be trained to recognize and like them, and she's talking about this kind of avant-garde food. It is necessary to set up programs to teach children taste and to organize workshops for adults to study the taste of different foods, etc., offering people the opportunity to expand their horizons. This education in taste, and she calls it education, study, teach, training, can mean education in the objective detection of flavors using the techniques refined by food scientists in the last couple of decades, and the opportunity to explore novel tastes and textures, or it can be education in good taste, whatever that means, a much more subjective matter, and traditionally, well, yeah, you can see she's very skeptical of this project, right? In the tone, but it's there, right? It's clear that at least this aspect of certain avant-garde is present also in food, the idea that you need to learn to appreciate it. And as I said, there's debate about exactly what this means and exactly what sort of knowledge. Is it a skill? Is it a know-how, a know-what, whatever? But there are all these very well-established practices of actually training your palate, your judgment, into appreciating this good food, right? It's a very anti-populist stance. There's not anybody who can detect, right? Sarah, yesterday she said, like, yeah, you cannot detect it if you cannot taste it. You cannot you cannot know the difference if you cannot taste it. So this goes very well in this tradition. The food connoisseurs, this is empirical data that I am right in calling connoisseurs an actual normative stance, right? Empirical work done by people like Buckley, Cohen, and McCarthy, this is, I think, was done in the UK, shows that there is a set of normative values that actually go together in these so-called food connoisseurs. And they found empirically that the food connoisseurs are distinguished by the low importance placed on almost all of the convenience factors. The segment is the least likely to snack between meals or to snack instead of eating meals. The segment is less likely to select convenience food to make life easier. Saving time and energy is not important. They're not like time pressure. They like slow food. They have no problem with the slow food. They don't check the food. Oh, this sounds so bad. They don't check the price of their food and are the least inclined to be cooking and meal preparation as the sole responsibility of the woman in the household. This is what they empirically found about these so-called connoisseurs. And again, this echoes a lot of what Georgina Born found in an analogous avant-garde in music, where experimentation is important, right? We are trying to, these people like Varese and the early avant-garde before or against, that is commonly contrasted with serialism and post-serialism, was a very performance-based avant-garde. I don't know how well you know the history of 20th century experimental music. Yes, more or less. Okay. Well, there's a big strand about doing these nice happenings where people just come together and improvise and you try to find new sounds, right? But that is not enough to characterize this tradition, because the question is how they thought you should relate to instruments in order to produce this kind of sounds. And it was a very, very bodily related conception of how we should relate to instruments in order to get those sounds, right? It was very performance-driven. People got together, and in that context, the sounds came. And it echoes a lot of the way food connoisseurs talk about communal meals, about how you get together. The food comes from this process-based way of cooking. You have the incorporation of non-Western sounds, and it is also an incorporation of non-Western flavors and techniques into this food. And there is, this is also something very physical, very embodied aspect of this sort of experimentation. This is a quote from Nicola Lawson. She said, like, this is about the feel of the dough in my fingers, the scent of a lemon as I sass the skin, and the aromatic oils spritz in the air, the sizzle of onions in a pan, the dark gleaming beauty of an eggplant. Cooking provides this deep aesthetic pleasure, right? That's one of the reasons, one of the things we want to keep about food in new food. And this is very similar to what we read if we read discussions within the musical avant-garde about how music should be made, how the new music should be made. It's about keeping the bodily, the embodied aspect of improvisation and experimentation. So it's, Rachel Loudon calls these people like the food Luddites, but I think it's not an accurate picture, because it's not that they are against technology, but that they have a very specific view of how technology should be. This is both true about food and true about music. You want technology that doesn't distance you from the food or doesn't distance you from the music, right? As you know, I do experimental electronic music, and this is a very big debate in music. People are really very interested in how are we going to make a technological, experimental music and keeping this embodied aspect. So that's why people, use this very disparaging term. People talk about button pushers or mouse draggers. Like, this is bad, right? So these are like the bad guys for these people. This is Martin Sumaya and Jorge Carlos Esboon. It's a really cool guy. And because, like, oh my God, what is that? I mean, like, this is so non-embodied, right? You have a visual interface, and you are coding, and that's making music, right? And you don't see a clear relation between your body movements and the sound that is coming. That's almost every time I play, that's what most people complain about when I play. They were like, it sounded good, but I could never relate what you were doing with what was coming. It just seemed like so disconnected. And there's, again, it's not just my anecdotic evidence. There, Magnus and Hurtado Mendieta made an actual survey about this sort of musicians, and they found that, yeah, playing digital instruments, or at least this kind of digital instruments, the ones that have screen interfaces, seem to be less of an embodied practice, as the mapping between gesture and sound can be changed so easily by changing a variable, setting a patch of a program. And here are some of the things that the musicians said in this survey about the relationship with the instruments. Like, they said things like, I don't feel like I'm playing a digital instrument so much as operating it. Full control is not interesting for experimentation, but lack of control is not useful for composition. I think acoustic instruments seem to be more right brain or spatial, and digital instruments seem to be more left brain and linguistic. And they said this very sharp distinction between these sort of technology. But as I said, that is one way to go. As you can imagine, there's also the opposite way to go, and there's a very large tradition to actually say, like, no, they are in the right. That's the way we should go. We should get rid of embodiment and put the stress on control. So that is what I'm calling, again, following Born, hypermodernism. So another way of embracing of doing avant-garde art, at least in music and in food, is to go hypermodern. And the hypermodern is kind of the opposite picture of this way of thinking of the avant-garde. Here, embodiment is important. What is important is like a rational, a theory-driven sort of experimentation. So experimentation is still there, but it's not experimentation based on performing, based on how we move, but based on theories about what either music or food is or can be, right? So you use theory to try to understand what food can be or what music can be, and from that you develop the tools that you need in order to bring these theories to practice, right? Here's Hollis and Jones talking about Blumenthal's The Fat Dog. His cuisine challenges diners to reflect on the seemingly obvious categories. For example, the distinction between sweet and savory, hot and cold, raw and cooked, that organize our normal culinary and cultural experience. The Fat Dog's menu began to confuse different meals events by including breakfast goods such as parsnip cereal and snail porridge in a lunch or diner menu. It also disrupted the expected sequence of a meal, things like that. So the idea here is that to the question of what should people know in order to appreciate food, the answer is not that they should learn something new in order to properly appreciate these art pieces, but that they should forget what they thought they knew. So the idea is to question this given knowledge that which we, or the people, normal people, approach art. This is true, again, in music, where people in the like serialist and post-serialist talk about challenging our basic idea of what it is, whether there's a distinction between composing and performing, or what it is for a piece to have a beginning and end, of the identity of the pieces. It was very conceptual-driven avant-garde. And something similar happens in a certain kind of cuisine that it's also based in an experimentation that is more conceptual. And non-surprisingly, both in music and in food, these people commonly tend to look for ways of collaborating with artists and scientists and engineers. Here is Born talking about music, but she could very well be talking about food. Since the beginning, modernist artists showed a concern and fascination with new media, technology, and science. According to Peter Walling, she quotes, modernism developed an aesthetic of the engineer. And just they were looking at the newest theory of vision in order to produce their visual art pieces. They were looking at the latest theory of sound in order to engineer new sounds. And you can see this happening in a certain culinary avant-garde, where people work with food scientists, work with chemists, with biologists, with people that can develop new ways of approaching food that goes not from what we already know so much as from what science can reveal about food. Here is food. Avant-garde cuisine has emerged as a new scientific area, and they even present themselves as science itself, not like an application of science, but like actual science, investigating the physico-chemical transformation of base ingredients that occur in cooking. Chefs can make practical use of scientifically rational techniques, and rational is another key word that is very common in this sort of avant-garde, both in music and in food. Scientifically rational techniques to assemble edible materials into a variety of culinary creations. And if you look at this literature, this is not like a rare example. Actually, this is very, very, very common. You find this especially at the very first paragraphs or introductory remarks. They always position themselves as, you know, scientifically rational and avant-garde. These both go together because that's a very common way of understanding what it is for something to be avant-garde. I keep reading. Benefiting from innovations made possible by progress in physical chemistry, many psychochemical transformation of ingredients in cooking processes were investigated, and blah, 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 right? So there's this very scientific way of understanding experimentation, which is very contrastive to the other more performance-based and more embodied way of conceiving. And actually, if you read the embodied ones, they also like these other quotes where they say like, oh yeah, we should go against Descartes and we should go against rationality and bring back our intuitions and things like that. Another commonality between this second hypermodernist avant-garde in music and in food, but I don't know how much time do I have left.
Yeah, 10 to 15.
Okay, so I'm not going to go into this a lot, but it's very textual, right? We have a lot of manifestos, and you have books, and the music is written, it sounds, and the food also is written as much as it is tasted. But I'm not going to go into that, but that's another very common feature to both of them. It's also very common is the way they conceive the relation to tradition, the relation between experimentation and tradition. This is from an actual manifesto that Barham and other chefs wrote, and they were like, you know, we value tradition, but we are trying to develop tradition, right? They say the world's culinary traditions are collective, cumulative inventions, a heritage created by hundreds of generations of cooks. Tradition is the base, which all cooks who aspire to excellence must know and master, and our approach builds on that. But it evolves, and we are embracing this natural process of evolution and inspired to influence it. We respect our rich history, and at the same time attempt to play a small part in the history of tomorrow. You know, this is a very, very modern discourse of how experimentation is seen as the development of a tradition. And this is common both to the manifestos of the hypermodern avant-garde in music and probably in other arts. I don't know. That's the truth. As it is in food. So you can see that the similarities start piling up. Something I want to say about tradition, just because it's another topic I'm working on, is that, and also because it has to do with yesterday's talk about nostalgia, is that tradition is not history, right? It is not like a factual antecedents of how we do things. It's more myth-making, right? It is more of a projection of our current ideals in a past way. And this is, again, Rachel Loudon. And Rachel Loudon is a historian, right? So she's like, okay, you know, this thing people call culinary traditions, this is all made up, as almost any tradition, right? I'm a historian, she says. As a historian, I cannot accept the account of the past implied by culinary elitism. Remember, that's how she calls the connoisseurs. A past sharply divided between good and bad, where the sunny rural days of the yore and the gray industrial present, right? So their reaction to technology is as long as technology represents this mythical bad present, right? And the days of yours is the lauded fable of disaster, of a fall from grace. And she said, well, this is much more of wishful thinking than of actually digging through archives. It gains credence, not from scholarship, but from evocative dichotomies. Fresh and natural versus processed and preserved, local versus global, slow versus fast, artisanal and traditional versus urban and industrial, healthful versus contaminated and fatty. And if you take this part, this all could be, she could be talking about musical avant-garde, a musical experimentation. Because the first avant-garde I was talking, they also think it's very important to keep, well, not fresh, but keep sound natural versus processed or preserved. So that's why it's more performance-based than recorded or theorized or actually having scripts and things like that. It is local because it is happening at that moment. It's slow, it's not computer-based, and it's artisanal, things like that. So, if I am right, I think these similarities are something that should be accounted for, right? This is, I think, too striking a phenomenon to just say, I don't know, it's casualty or whatever. And now the question is what to make of this, what to make of the fact that we have these strong similarities between these two ways of understanding how we can go in the avant-garde. Is that enough, or does it shed some evidence in favor of the hypothesis that music is an art form? I don't know, right? It's a lot of work that still needs to be done. But at least I think we do have, as a natural hypothesis, that the reason why we have similar avant-gardes in music and in food is because food is an art form, just like music is. But of course, that is not the only one. You could say, like, well, maybe this is something about the very notion of avant-garde, or about what are the possible ways to be anti-populist, or maybe there is some other concept that can be served as function of bridge between these two fields that doesn't have to be art. But at least it is clear that there is something that needs to be explained. And that, just assuming that the phenomenon is the same in both cases, seems to be a very straightforward default hypothesis. Okay? No, I'm not finished. Okay, no, the question is now, why? Okay, so, yeah, because it's very obvious that there are like huge elephants in the room of very strong dissimilarities between the musical avant-garde and the culinary avant-garde, and it would be very dishonest of me to just, you know, shove them under the rug. I'm going to just go two of the largest one, probably this two manifestations of the same one, but also because this is something that Born is very, very, very aware, very emphatic, which is that the musical avant-garde happens in places like this, like the ICRAM in Paris. You know, this happens in state-sponsored research centers, right? These are public money that goes into having these research centers, and the discourse of justification, where all this theory came from, was actually theory developed to justify assigning public funds to doing this kind of experimentation. So this discourse that I find is very similar to the discourse presented in the culinary hypermodern avant-garde actually happens in very different contexts. Because this is a very different context from, you know, the Parlour in West London, right? This is not public space. This is not state-sponsored. This is an expensive place where people actually are willing to spend a lot of money in order to fund this experimentation. And that is something that would also have to be explained, right? If I want to take seriously the idea that that this is, in a certain sense, the same phenomenon, I would also need to explain why, even though there are so many similarities, this happen in such different contexts. And also, this is something that just came out a few minutes ago, well, like an hour ago, is that experimentation in music mostly centers around noise. Both the hypermodern and the connoisseur musical avant-garde placed a heavy emphasis on working with noise, on trying to challenge our conception of what noise is and how can noise be musical, and how the incorporation of noise can help the evolution of our musical tradition. There is nothing of the sort, I think, in the culinary avant-garde. And this is really right. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. But I don't know of any culinary avant-garde that goes like, well, you know, this is going to be disgusting, right? Or this is going to be really, really, really spicy, or really, really salty, or this is going to be really appalling. But that is part of the point. If we really think that the culinary avant-garde is actually questioning some basic principles of what we think food is, then it should also be willing to experiment with non-tasty stuff, stuff that is non-healthy, that stuff that is appalling, that make me wants you to puke, and things like that. And then I would be more willing to say, like, yeah, I think we have good reasons to say that the culinary avant-garde is literally an artistic avant-garde. Thank you.
Thanks, Axel, for this paper, who gave me the opportunity to think about two of the things I dislike the most, namely Pierre Boulez and molecular cuisine. If you want to kill me, just have me in a molecular cuisine restaurant listening to the master without hammer. I'm going to die after the first two courses, I guess. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to just give a short summary of what I think are the main claim of the paper and the main arguments, and then I'm going to give you what I think are a number of objections. I don't think these objections are deadly, but I think they, give us opportunity at least to talk. Okay, so the main claim of the paper, I think, is the following quote. I want to argue that a conception of art that includes food would help us build a theoretical bridge that would allow us to exploit the cognitive resources we have developed for the understanding of current art practices, to understand culinary practices as well. And I think Axel gives two main arguments for this claim. The first one I'm going to call the abductive argument, and the second one I'm going to call the understanding arguments. So the abductive argument is pretty simple. It goes like this. First premise, there's a set of criteria which applies to both to art and food. Second premise, the simplest way to explain why these criteria seem as useful in other arts as they are in food is just to recognize that food is art, and food is art. And the understanding argument is that something along these lines, if we can run parallel stories for understanding different practices, then these practices are of the same kind. Second premise, we can run parallel stories for understanding 20th century musical avant-garde and recent culinary avant-garde. Hence, these two practices are of the same kind. They are both art. Okay, so here is a main premise on which the abductive argument relies. So it's a premise that I think Axel takes from Mashri. Basically, it goes like this. If a concept is helpful in making sense of some phenomenon, even if the phenomenon was not part of the intended domain of the concept, we'd better take it literally and just expand its application to cover the new phenomenon. So the reasoning then is we have these criteria from the domain of art that Axel presented at the beginning, and they seem to apply straightforwardly to food. Then we should expand the domain of art and include food in it. So my problem is that are we really sure that the criteria we start from really are criteria that delimit the domain of art? Or do they delimit actually a larger domain which could contain both art and food? And I think the latter is the case. I think as a matter of fact, it seems to me that these criteria, they apply straightforwardly to what we might call in general evaluative practices or a subset of them. Take, for instance, the practice of buying a car and assume that cars are not art and buying a car is not an art performance. Then it seems to me that all these criteria might be relevant when we actually want to buy a car. So aesthetic criteria, does the car have aesthetic value? Is it a nice car? Romantic criteria, does the car express masterful engineering techniques? So you have a nice Jaguar, it looks nice, very beautiful engine. Kantian criteria, is the car at the peak of a certain tradition? So is it the best expression of the thermic engine? Or is it the beginning of a new tradition? So take Tesla, I really dislike cars. So if you want me to die, it's molecular food.
What's in mind?
A lot of things. Hermeneutic vitus, so how informative about cars are the engineering techniques, so on and so forth. I'm not going to do all of them, but you can imagine that they basically all apply. Okay, so in a nutshell, I think the argument I think so far it flashes us some respect in which our food choices stand for normative evaluation, but I can't see why this should provide us with any ground for thinking that food is art. Okay, now I turn to argument B. So Bourne's analysis targets a subfield of professional musical composition. She claims that we can structure an understanding of composing in the 20th century by answering for each composer the following question: how much knowledge is required to properly appreciate a work of art? So here is the initial question I have is, who or what sets the requirements of the knowledge? So these are two options which, of course, are not exhaustive. But the first one, you might say, well, you know, it's just a matter of fact. We just see how the listeners react, and then we sort of know which is the music which doesn't require the knowledge, and which is the music that requires the knowledge. And I think this is, of course, not what these people have in mind. I think it's a matter of intention, or a matter of self-understanding of the practice. Namely, is the music composed with the maker's intention that no knowledge is required for its appreciation, or on the contrary? So I should assume that the proper reading is the latter. Bohn is structuring the field of professional musical composition in terms of composer's intention. Then we can split them out between populists, who have this intention that no knowledge is required, and avant-gardists, who tend to produce music whose appreciation requires special knowledge. And in the case of music, avant-gardism come in two kinds: experimental postmodernism and hypermodernism. The first one is somewhat moving away from the authority of the score, taking performance as being the main focus of composition, and with the aim also of fusing different musical traditions with an first approach. So here, of course, it requires some knowledge. You need to know something with the relation between the score and the performance to understand what these people are doing. You need to know something about musical traditions. So in the case of hypermodernism, the idea is that music results from a theory-first approach. So here you also need to know quite a lot of theory. If you make sense of dodecaphonism, well, you shouldn't listen to it. For instance, you should know that there's something about the structure of the 12 notes. So Axel's claim is that we can understand the recent history of the culinary field just in the same way, first by distinguishing populism from avant-garde, and second by distinguishing two kinds of avant-garde, connoisseur and culinary hypermodernist, though I think you don't really have exactly the same dichotomy, because the sort of hypermodernism you want to have don't really want to have the appeal to knowledge. So I think there's a small disanalogy here. Anyway, so I want to point out what I think are three main problems I see with this second argument. And I think they all pertain to the second premise, of course, no mystery. We can and the second premise for this one, we can roll parallel stories for understanding 20th century musical avant-garde and recent culinary avant-garde. So the first one is a structural problem. So if we are to strictly apply Bohn's strategy to the culinary field, we should look at food producers' intention and identify two sets of producers: those who intend their food to be appreciated without prior knowledge, and those who intend their food to be appreciated with prior knowledge. And among the latter group, we should identify counterparts to experimental postmodernism and hypermodernism. However, it doesn't seem that this is what we are tracking in the culinary field. Why? Well, because in the culinary field, we are tracking, first of all, the mix of producers and consumers. So it's not the case in music. Bohn is not tracking listeners. She's tracking composers. So that's the first dynamic. Well, you might say, well, look, it doesn't matter, because in the case of food producers and food consumers, they can just share intentions. And I think this is quite wrong. So I'm living in Switzerland's main cheese production area. The picture at the beginning, the kind of scenery I have when I look outside my window, and I can tell you that these people producing cheese, they have only one intention: producing cheese, and the kind of cheese they do. So the sort of intentions that the connoisseurs could have, they could have intentions in eating the cheese, being very discriminative, eating it with lots of prerequisites, but these are not shared intentions between the two. Okay, and second, we are tracking also, I think that's very important, in the case of the culinary field, a mix of professional and amateurs practitioners. And I think it seems hard to conceive that each of them share a same practice, which can be enlightened by a same narrative, which would take the shape of Bohn-like narrative. So now I turn to the avant-garde problem. So I think one question is, who is part of the culinary equivalent of the musical avant-garde? And in particular, are connoisseurs really part of it? And here, I think this Laudon quotes. I have to read more of her because that's the kind of person I seem to a priori dislike. So, and question seems to me because it seems that the notion of avant-garde, first of all, it's restricted more to, so that's more about you than about her. So first of all, it's more restricted to professional practitioners. And connoisseurs, they've been introduced either as consumers or as amateurs. And at best, these connoisseurs, they could be said to respond to a certain culinary avant-garde. But the question is which one? And it's here where I wouldn't describe the sort of culinary practice to which the connoisseurs respond as being an avant-garde in any sense. Why? Because the notion of avant-garde, of course, it's up for grabs. But so if you take a kind of Bourdieusian cultural field notion of avant-garde, so the avant-garde people, they're very specific people. They're new entrants in the cultural field that have to sort of fight against the tradition to establish themselves as being people with enough cultural capital. But it's not the kind of things that the connoisseurs are. That's not the kind of people who the connoisseurs are. And the kind of practice, culinary practice to which they respond, they don't fit also that model. I think they are rather part of an established group which tries to ensure that some established culinary value remains. So I guess, I guess that's the sense of the education to taste that Laudon describes in the quote is actually an aim at preserving certain taste habits and some local traditional modes of productions in the face of food standardization. And for instance, that's exactly what the slow food movement in Europe is all about. You know, they really want to keep it open, gustatorially speaking, these traditional modes of production. Okay, finally, the knowledge problem. So in the end, Axel, he tries to set up a distinction between a culinary avant-garde which makes knowledge crucial and a culinary avant-garde which makes ignorance crucial. The question is, which kind of knowledge are we speaking about? Is it propositional knowledge about food and food production? Is it phenomenal knowledge about food and flavor, or is it still something else? So if it were to be propositional knowledge, I think it wouldn't be really plausible that any kind of culinary avant-garde would require propositional ignorance as the prerequisite of its appreciation. Certainly any avant-garde chef wants us to know that so-and-so is food, that she sources the product from the good ways, it's good quality food, that some food contains meat, so on and so forth. It seems really weird also to say that it's ignorance about phenomenal knowledge about the flavors. Why? Because take the case of modernist cuisine, for instance. It's part of the kind of games they're playing with expectations that you must know the flavors. So it must be something else. And I think the claim for ignorance is, or forgetfulness seems to be less about the content of the food, about its vehicle. So it would be a kind of vehicle-content relation in the case of food. Don't forget propositional knowledge about food or phenomenal knowledge about flavor. Rather forget any kind of food, another form of vehicle, you standardly know it. So this might be the case. I agree in the case of molecular cuisine or modernist cuisine. But that shouldn't lead us to overlook the common appeal to propositional knowledge and phenomenal knowledge in all kinds of culinary avant-gardes. And if I have time, can I make a final word? Yeah, good. So the justification of a narrative like Bohn's, it seems to relies on it being a good heuristic to foster understanding of recent history of composition. So is Bohn's narrative a good heuristic for the musical avant-garde? Well, I have no idea because I'm not a specialist. But does applying Bohn's narrative to food delivery a good heuristic? And here I have an idea, and I think the problem is not really. And I think one of the reasons is actually pointed in your paper, because you recognize that culinary avant-gardes, contrary to aesthetic ones, have a hard time cutting all ties with traditions. And they're rather, cumulative practices where you build up on past traditions and you make some kind of further elaboration of the tradition. So as a result, the avant-garde chefs, they don't justify their practice as a kind of cutoff from the past practices, as it's often the case in the art world. So to me, this sounds like a field which doesn't really need a narrative like Bohn's, actually. And he needs something else. He needs an account of the notion of culinary tradition and an account of culinary creativity and of the possible interaction. And as it turns out, I have an account of this, but for this, you'd have to invite me another time.
I don't like talking about intentions. It's too individualistic for me. Yeah. So I like who is making this demand of forgetting or knowing or respecting the people? Who is doing this, right? And I don't think it's an actual individual act that might be intentional or non-intentional. I think it is a discourse feature. So it has something more to do with justificatory practices, and so because you can see it in documents and things like that, and it's more socially constructed. And I think that helps also explain why the dynamic between consumer and producer is not, it doesn't need to be so sharp, but it has to do more with how we construct the consumer. So the consumer is constructed through both the discourse of the consumers and the discourse of the producer. So that's why the documents that I appeal to are things like manifestos and articles and things like that. And also that's something that Bourne does, right? She doesn't just go to the interview, but she looks at the manifestos and about the documents that people, when they ask for funds for these things, write and things like that. So that's how it would go in order to, which is actually central to most of your comments. And the second is, maybe I'm cheating, but I take on board Rachel Loudon's criticism of slow food. So I'm going to challenge the way you think slow food is, because I do think Loudon is right that slow food is revisionistic. It's not conservative in the way you present it. It's in general, conservativity is never, like being a conservative is never about actually keeping current values, right? The very idea of educating for preserving has a very obvious inner tension, right? If it's already there, you don't need to educate it. So it's more about promoting the idea that this is what we have been, regardless of what we have actually been, right? And if you present it that way, which I think Rachel Loudon has good reasons to conceive it as the slow food movement that way, then it's easier to fit it into this picture. But you're right that it is this to be developed.
All right, let's have questions. Hands in the air. Okay, we'll start with you right there.
Thanks.
So I kind of like the example with the car avant-garde because
oh, I forgot about that. Yeah,
there is a car avant-garde. It's just not Jaguars. It's the people who live in Utah and like build like crazy cars and try to experiment with electric motors and put them on bikes. And so this is the car avant-garde. Yeah. And I'm wondering to what extent you want to say that because there is an analogy between musical avant-garde or possibly painting avant-garde and this car avant-garde, this car making could count as a form of art. So that's kind of one question. And another question is, well, maybe it doesn't count as a form of art, and maybe food also doesn't count as a form of art, at least not on the basis of this argument. But if that's the case, then maybe the fact that there is this analogy in the avant-garde reveals that there are some very significant aesthetic features that all of these disciplines share. So I just wanted to know what.
Yeah, that's why I tried to say since the beginning that the strategy was very different from something like Mathens, where you do have like sufficient conditions. Like, well, this is what we would expect to find in art. It's here in art, good. And more of a all things considered, what kind of things we should consider when we're answering the question. And I think what Patrick is pushing is like, you cannot do that. You cannot be that wishy-washy. You cannot tell us exactly what kind of evidence this is giving. And I think that's fair enough. And you are right. And again, since the question is about the explanatory value, I think I would have to bite the bullet and say, like, whenever it is of explanatory value to use this strong notion of avant-garde, yeah, we should do it, right? And if we find it in cars, then we should do it. And I actually wrote something about this, about actually applying this to other areas that are considered either minor arts or not art at all. And yeah, I think Patrick is right that you need very little in order to find all these things. Right? All you need is that it is well, at least I speculated in that text, a service-oriented practice that has at least some sensory element. If you have those two things, you're probably going to get most of the things that you get in the first list. But that's also why I thought the most interesting thing was what Patrick calls the understanding argument, right? Is the storytelling, the fact that not that we have all these questions, but that how we answer all these questions clusters in certain trends. That's more interesting, and that is more robust similarities, but you're completely right.
Do you want to learn?
So I'm not quite sure how an historiographic parallel, such as the comparison between the history of music and the history of food, can lead to the conclusion that food can be art.
Okay.
Because in simplified terms, I think that your thesis can be reduced to, okay, so art can be experimentation. And, well, a lot of things that are not art can be experimental, such as historiography itself. For example, I think of Italian microhistory, that many people consider it a form of experimentation through methodology. So, in what extent does this parallel justify the instance of art in food?
Yeah, no, you're completely right. Actually, also what I tried to say, and again, Patrick was very clear about it, is that if it's not art, we still need a competing hypothesis, right? And I like your competing hypothesis. It's just the idea that any practice that evolves through experimentation is probably going to have to ask these sort of questions, right? What do we mean by experimentation? Is this theory-laden, like theory-first experimentation, or practice-first experimentation? So the question then becomes, what makes it history, place where you can evolve through experimentation, music as well, and food as well? And that, I think, is a very, very interesting question, which is good, right? So again, the idea is to actually test art as an explanatory concept. And as to taking seriously the exploration of art as an explanatory concept is to say, what value do we get from applying it in this field, food, that it hasn't traditionally been applied? What kind of new questions arise? And I think yours is one of the examples of what kind of good questions, with good theoretical questions arise from it. And what I come to be that is part of the argument for doing it. So yeah, the idea is that we're not discovering, that's also very, very clear in Patrick's quote, we're not discovering whether food is art or not, but we are rehearsing, we're experimenting with the idea that food is art.
I didn't want to give Sebas the next question, but he's right in front of you, so just hand him the mic.
Thank you very much. So, I would like to ask you about this anti-populist claim, because it's not clear to me that there has to be there, and the reasons that are to be there is not part of the experimentation. So the first time that I cooked a lamb shoulder for 3 days at 65 degrees to my mom, she excelled at appreciating the texture. So there was something that she didn't need any sort of formation in order to appreciate that is more tender. And this is a new technique. And the reason why it's not so popular is because at the very beginning you have the Ronet that the Hermano Roca created, and you don't have these machines. Now you have an ANOVA, and everyone by $100 can do that at his place. So it's a matter of how the cuisine works. So you have to experiment, and you have to prepare something in which you have to use a lot of products, and expensive products during many times, so it's expensive. But most of the people working there, they make the business, the lucrative business is another sort of, you have Astrid and Gaston, have Lamar, and many other restaurants where he applies all these things. So I don't see the anti-populist in most of the things. So you go to Oaxaca, and where there is probably the main pole of Novel Cuisine, and you don't have these sort of things. So
No, the answer is very, very, very simple, and I was just not very clear about it. I didn't mean to conflate the distinction between populism and anti-populism with avant-garde and other kind of food. There is populist avant-garde, and that is also common both in music and in cooking. So, of course, that you're gonna keep you're gonna have people who think that the best way to keep developing our tradition is to keep trying to do music or food that works at this level, right? That it just tastes good. That is what is important about it. And the new techniques and the new technology is going to be geared in that direction. I didn't try to say that avant-garde always has to be anti-populist.
But spherification, for example, is likewise populist. So anyone can take a pill and feeling the explosion in the mouth. You don't need any sort of connaissance or whatever.
But that was okay. But that was Patrick's question. Like, who says that we need it, right? It's not the fact that we need it. Is the fact that this is constructed in such a way that it is said that, oh, this is something that you need to insert in a certain discourse that has certain requirements of how the consumer is constructed. And I think Patrick tried to be very clear about it. Do you remember this part of the reply?
I have some likely suspects: Alessandro, Sam, Eileen, Oku, and Mohan. Did I miss anyone?
Okay, I'll try to be short, right? All right.
I'll go alphabetical by first name, Alessandro.
Yeah, so actually this is kind of a follow-up to this about the populism versus elitism. So if somebody asks you how much do you know in order to appreciate it, I don't think that appreciation has a univocal meaning. You know,
no, that's a good point.
You know, if I read a bestseller, say Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, I can appreciate it as a novel. I can appreciate it as a historical reconstruction. I can appreciate it as a philological or philosophical kind of essay. So there are many ways of understanding something. So is there a privileged one, which is the reference of that debate? Or are we just being ambiguous? Or am I considering the disjunction of these things?
No, you're completely right. I don't have an answer to that, and that's the kind of questions you have to answer. No, yeah, you're right.
Thanks.
Can I change my mind?
And this is actually a follow-up to previous two questions in a way.
Oh, good.
So
Well,
this is somewhat vague. So I recently read Marinetti's Futurist cookbook.
Yeah.
It's like really fascinating, or slightly, I mean, somewhat disturbing book as well. And I mean, it seems, at least it presents itself as an avant-gardist being a populist.
Yeah, you're right.
We might say that fake populism is kind of populist is fiction or something like that. But it's still like there is an attempt by him to kind of, I don't know, make Italians into airplanes. So, but I mean, it's just like what to think of this kind of interaction between avant-garde and populism.
Good. That gives me like a pretext to present like some of the work we are doing in Mexico, and I'm going to give again short answer. This is the distinction people already made between food in art, that it's already art, that it's artistic not because it is developing the culinary tradition, but because it's developing an artistic tradition. And so I think that is what's happening with the futurist cookbook. It's more of a futurist. It's more futurist than cookbook. Yeah, how do we draw those lines? It fits my story, so I'm going to stick to that. Yeah, it's short.
There is actually a great avant-garde disc by Mike Patton, inspired by
the futurist.
Yeah.
Cool. Should listen.
Okay, really enjoyed that. And I want to ask about the relationship between your starting point and the avant-garde. That is being appalled about going to KFC. And I used to live at La Home and in Kentucky, and I did want to mention that corporation, while I was living there, the multinational, renamed itself Yum Brands. Which is just somehow really offensive. But that outrage and the problem, knowing how to eat, what should we eat, And then is the, I don't understand what's the relation between what the avant-garde movements might offer us. Can art help us with, suppose your argument works, which I actually thought was pretty, but does it help us with that question?
Oh, yes, no. I'm not trying to do normative theory about how we should actually answer these questions. I was trying to explain how people, in fact, answer these questions. Right? So it's true that people like us feel appalled about the idea of going to KFC, and that we don't just not go, but we build discourses about why we don't. And those are the ones I'm trying to explain. But I am neutral about whether we're right, we're wrong, what should be the right criteria. Yeah. So I'm sorry.
Pass the mic to Moa.
So this is just another version of the same question, but I was also in my paper, I was sort of struck by the fact that discriminative savoring sort of is swamped by non-discriminative savoring, and that food as an art is always it's a criticism of a dish, whether it's produced by molecular gastronomy or any other avant-garde, that it's a criticism if it lacks flavor, for instance, or lacks any of those mouthfeel things, like including texture, etc. So isn't that a fundamental disanalogy? I mean, you suggested right at the end that maybe it was, but...
Okay, so my last part was something that I think is very, very striking
so
for me.
I was struck by there's the series Chef's Table, which I'm sure everybody's watched on Netflix, and the one on Linnaea, Grant de Schatz, the sort of king of molecular gastronomy, and all of the customer interviews said there are all these young people with wealthy parents, obviously, right, sitting there in Linnaea, and they say, "Oh, it's delicious. Oh, it's delicious." As if that's the only thing. I mean, you could have said that.
Yes. No. That's another point I was trying to make. I think again, Patrick in the commentary was right in saying that it is central. I think it is central for me that at least, if not the major, at least one of the major points of this analogy is that, and that is something that we need to theorize or practice. Yeah, maybe we should go and just try to make food that people say, wow, that was great, that tasted horrible, was disgusting, but it was just awesome. I would love that there would be such kind of food.
Yeah, the question is whether it would be food.
Oh, it would be avant-garde food, definitely, I think. But yeah, I know that. Okay. Sí, perdón, Sam.
Yeah, I'll just follow up on two strands. So one, on the populist avant-garde thing, I feel like, I actually think Taco Bell is like a world leader in avant-garde.
Yeah, because
they
you're right.
You think tacos have to be made with tortilla? No, you can make it with the fried chicken.
Yeah.
That's your outside part. So I'm not sure the two are in opposition. So in the second, I think I was pretty convinced by all the paper except the disanalogies. And I do think there are a lot of avant-garde food that fit the bill. So here are like 3 dishes from Al Louis' catalog that I think fit. So one is carrot air, where it's just air. And they are slightly carrot textured and flavored. So I think, it's not, challenge is conditioner. Air can be food. And again, gets back to this question, is it food or not? But I think it's plausibly avant-garde food. There's a dish where you have a bunch of spices and you eat them and guess them, and it's part of the dish. There's a dish where you have 3 latex gloves and on a couple of cups, and this is the finishing dish, so they kind of wave goodbye to you at the end of a meal. And in one of those cups, there are some marshmallows. You have to take off each glove and guess which one it is. So again, I think all these are plausibly analogous to this sort of noise avant-garde music. And I just want to say, I'm sure you know this, but just for other people, the avant-garde noise music aren't always just abrasive. They're noise in all sorts of ways. They can be like field recordings, have all more of the texture.
or like things more on the silence side. So I think they're more textual and they expand beyond like noise as just abrasive.
You're
So
right.
and I think the air case is especially like that.
No, that's awesome. That's great. I hope I'm going to have to look into them in more detail. I don't know enough, but if it's as you described it, that's great. That means that we do have that the analogy extends more. Even though, as you just said, the abrasive aspect of noise is played a very important role. Not so much in the first one, but in the second. Well, no, in the first one as well. And so maybe that this analogy has to be sharpened, but that doesn't mean that it is not. But if it's so small, maybe it's not as significant as I've made it to be. Right? Right? Yeah. And regarding KFC or Kentucky Fried Taco Bell. Oh yeah, that's true. I'm sorry, Taco Bell. Taco Bell, I agree completely, but I thought that's why it fits with my account where the distinction between populism and anti-populism is not a distinction between avant-garde and non-avant-garde. Right, and that is something that I should be more clear about. Thank you.
Patrick had a follow-up to something?
Yeah, just to go in your direction for once.
Oh, good.
Barry Smith told me a couple of days ago about this. The place is very famous in Spain. It's sort of very elaborate. Sorry?
Bulgarians.
Yes, Bulgarians. And within the menu, there are a couple of dishes which are disgusting.
Oh, cool.
And the idea is to say the guy is trying to sort of, blend in the local tradition, and it's part of the local tradition to eat everything because it's basically a new area. And he says food, must not always be delicious. You need to recognize the fact that some of it is actually pretty disgusting.
They give chicken cartilage. as one of them.
Chicken cartilage.
Yeah.
So the apple
That's
that's like a central aspect of Japanese food.
That's just delicious.
Japanese people eat chicken parmesan.
It's like the insects. People love insects.
Yeah, no.
Anyone have another question? All right, let's just thank Axel.